folks. Thanks for watching. Happy Friday. I want to thank Eric yesterday for covering for me. I was out on vacation. I spent much of the week up in Wisconsin, lakes, sun, and family. So enjoyed that. But we kept remarking, while we were up there, how lucky we've been in parts of the Corn Belt this year. Avoiding kind of a midsummer heat, or at least like the heart of July seems to be the worst of the heat and humidity every single year. It hasn't been too bad yet. We've seen some warm nights. Eric talked about that this week. But in terms of those kind of daytime high temperatures and the mugginess, we've lucked out so far, but that luck is changing. We're going to get out into the forecast here. You're going to see heat and ridging starting to build back into the central part of the country. And kind of the credit question, Eric's been trying to answer this yesterday. We've been discussing it, is where that kind of ridge, drought, and heat risk might be extending to into August. If it's persistent enough to become a problem, what do we have to watch for? So I want to spend some time at the end of this video digging into that. In the meantime, just looking at the radar across the continental U.S. here today, I've started this loop kind of near the end of yesterday. So some of the activity you're seeing was really more last night. And we saw showers and thunderstorms moving through the Ohio Valley into the mid-Atlantic. Saw a lot of monsoonal thunderstorm and shower activity over the southwestern U.S., even getting kind of toward Las Vegas, Southern California, getting in on some of that up in Montana. Saw some severe storms move through here, the Havre area. Further east, you can see some of those. And the precipitation in some areas that need it was variable. So see some of those supercells moving through, leaving swaths of near an inch of rainfall. Outside of that, a lot less confident that we saw measurable precipitation in some of those areas. Where we did see measurable precipitation, where this is going to continue to be a concern today, is the I guess I call it remnants of this near tropical system that's been spinning near the Gulf here. And you can see it over Louisiana here today. Some of the rain showers yesterday getting into Mississippi and Alabama as well. But the center of it, I'm going to let this kind of catch us up to present time. See it almost there. See maybe that low-level circulation somewhere here, closer to the Red River of the south there. If we just kind of sum this up, let's look at the last 24 hours of precipitation. You can see a stretch here along that stalled front that Eric mentioned yesterday, and then kind of separated this tropical system here. You can see how these kind of what we call synoptically are not maybe as linked up here. So this system kind of playing by the mind of its own. And then the swaths of precipitation here through the Canadian Prairie, southern Alberta, far southern Saskatchewan, into Montana, and then a lot more less precipitation here over the western Dakotas. If we look at the broader flow responsible for this pattern that we're in now, if we just look up at 500 millibars, the wind here, I'll take that off the screen. You can see a ridge here starting to look pretty dominant, and it's really this ridge that we're going to be watching over the next 7 to 10 days as it migrates slowly up into the central U.S. And then further out into the forecast, the question is, does it stay here maybe over St. Louis or Nashville, or does it migrate further to the west? We're seeing some drought risk pop up here. And what I'll call maybe the western or central plains, maybe the winter wheat belt, that's the big fork in the road. I think as we transition into August, is this concern going to shift more in this direction, or more so over the east? We talked about a Nashville high at times this year, right? And some of that heat building in more so into the mid-Atlantic and the eastern U.S. versus maybe some of these high production states proper. If we look at the all hazards map as of this morning, flood watch is active again for the mid-Atlantic, West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, North Carolina as well, kind of the northern tier of that state. Heat advisories building in underneath that, right? Kind of lining up with what is, at least at the moment, right? Like a Miami or Bahamas high. And we can see that around the periphery of that and almost within the influence of that. Heat advisories here in the Carolinas. Over Arkansas, we have extreme heat warnings here over portions of Arkansas as well. So the heat's starting to build in underneath that high. And flood watches associated with that remnant tropical system here, and then some of the moisture moving into the mid-Atlantic. We can actually look over right at this earth.knowleschool.net. I should put let me put the link in the description here so you can get it. That's just a cool site. We can actually pull up total precipitable water. So Eric showed you, the flooding, unfortunately in Texas, all the high precipitable water values there at the early part of the month. But if we look at it here, just valid as of this morning, the most moisture in the atmosphere are often kind of trapped here near the equator. The atmosphere then tries to convince that to move northward at times with low pressure systems. The Bermuda High is an excellent vehicle to bring some of that tropical moisture. We always talk about those streamlines running through the mid-Atlantic up into the U.S., bringing our copious amounts of rainfall. You can see that here today with these streamlines bringing in that total precipitable water, higher values here over portions of the lower Mississippi River Valley. Again, connecting that to the tropical system here. If you also follow the streamlines and kind of look where they're shoving the moisture, that's kind of a simple way to show you where we're worried about rain. And you can see kind of two areas here. One, obviously, the remnant tropical system, but you can also see it pulling the moisture up into the mid-Atlantic here as well. It's not a surprise to see some of the flood watches there. If we look at the 500 millibar height forecast, this is from the ECMWF. I usually show this a little bit later in the forecast, but I want to point out this, again, we'll call it a Miami Ridge here this morning. This is 7 a.m. Friday from the ECMWF forecast here. But I'm going to take this, we're going to go well out into the forecast. We'll cover all the details of it in just a second here. But keep an eye on this ridge here. We have some flow across the northern tier of the country. That's what brought those supercells to Montana, bringing conditional severe weather today. We'll take a look at that. But it's really this ridge moving from Miami. This is now Saturday evening, maybe somewhere here, we'll call it, a Tallahassee ridge. Let's do Monday. Let's take it to Monday evening, get through the weekend. Okay, now maybe like a Little Rock ridge. We saw those extreme heat warnings here. That's consistent with that ridge moving further to the northwest as the heat builds underneath that. And then let's go all the way out to Wednesday evening, getting close to a week out now. This is looking more like that Nashville ridge that we talked about, maybe Cairo or St. Louis as we get into next week. And you'll notice that, okay, it's not obvious now as we get to the end of the forecast period which way it's shifting, right? Maybe it kind of remains over here as a Nashville ridge. Maybe you get something, like a Garden City ridge, right? That would be a concern for some of these Great Plains, and maybe we'll call it the winter wheat belt for the sake of this video. So that's kind of the question mark we're dealing with over the next 7 to 10 days, and frankly, even into August as well. Looking at some of the analogs that we'll do at the end of this video. You can check those out when I get to the slides kind of in this section here at the top of the video. What this means for today is, well, we're going to continue watch with that flow across the northern tier of the country, potential storms redeveloping. This is the 3-kilometer NAM model. I'm going to take this into 6 p.m. and 7 p.m. See storms firing here. See a little bit less precipitation unfolding over the lower Mississippi River Valley, but still showers and storms in this corridor here that we'll have to watch. We saw those flood watches posted for this area here. So you go into the day tomorrow on Saturday, that activity that we were looking at over the northern plains starts to shift over in the Midwest. So 1 p.m., 2 p.m., now 3 p.m., all the way out to 10 p.m. I took that a little quicker than I thought. See maybe this corridor here, some severe weather potential, and then storms reigniting in the western plains as we get through Saturday evening. And then again, as this ridge starts to move up into this area, we're going to see less precipitation all the while in the forecast here. Now, over the next kind of 3 days, what I just showed you from the 3-kilometer NAM, let's take a look at the precipitation forecast. We'll do this kind of quickly. There's that activity as we go through the day tomorrow on Saturday, and I'm taking this all the way out to Sunday afternoon. I'm watching this kind of corridor in here because there's still some dry counties in here, despite some of the rain we had over the last kind of 7 days. If we look at the soil moisture estimates from NASA, you can still see the southwest Michigan, northern Indiana, north central Illinois. I'll call it a drought because we do have some drought classifications still remaining in here. But I'm watching that quarter here because while this kind of run of the NAM misses it with a lot of significant precipitation, save for maybe a few counties in here in southwest Michigan, there's going to be a good chance here for rain and precipitation over the next kind of 48 to 72 hours with this system coming through. We can see that if we just jump over and look at the Storm Prediction Center outlook. So where are we looking at it today? Well, we mentioned that area of the flood watch, but potentially some severe storms along the Ohio River Valley, more so over toward the mid-Atlantic, east of the Appalachians, and then here today over what we'll call maybe the central Great Plains of northeast Nebraska, western Iowa, Dakota, southeast South Dakota, and then southwest Minnesota. That activity we saw switching further to the east tomorrow on Saturday, so eastern Iowa into Illinois, southern Michigan, right over that corridor, right, where we saw those drier counties settling in. And then out the day on Sunday, kind of this lingering front here as this ridge takes hold, and more of the south central portion of the country will have to look for the chance of some precipitation over that corridor here. If we look at the WPC, their excessive rainfall outlook, and I'm happy to see no longer looking at a moderate risk here over Louisiana and southern Mississippi, been downgraded to a slight risk, but again, watching this area for potential flooding today. Flood watch is still active in a few parishes here in Louisiana. Maybe more so the concern here in the mid-Atlantic, right? We saw those precipitable water values funneling in with perhaps some help from the Appalachians here. So we're going to have to watch for continued flash flooding concerns. The reason I'm kind of spending time on this is just it's been this theme this July where we've just seen a lot of these flooding events to keep an eye on. I want to jump over and look at the ECMWF precipitation forecast proper. So I'm going to make this valid as of this afternoon quickly. You can see that precipitation activity expected, showers and storms, potential flash flooding concerns for the mid-Atlantic today, even getting up toward the DC area. And then kind of waiting to see what kind of severe storms might fire here again over the central plains, Iowa. See some impressive rainfall values here coming out of the ECMWF global model, indicative of maybe some proper severe storm and supercell development. We'll have to watch out for some of that. As we go into tomorrow afternoon, let's take this Saturday, 1 to 7 p.m., You can see that activity shifting further to the east, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, southern Michigan. Again, this corridor here, keeping an eye on it for measurable precip. Then back over toward the Ohio River Valley through the evening. And then Sunday evening, right, that wide kind of marginal risk area that we were watching, potentially reignition of severe storms over in the Great Plains. But again, only a marginal risk right now from the Storm Prediction Center. We'll have to see if they upgrade that here. Now I'm going to take the forecast further out. This is now Monday. And then Tuesday, see what maybe looks like one of those kind of MCS derecho-like storms trying to sneak through here, Iowa and through northern and central Illinois. This is kind of that alley that we watch for this time of year for those derecho-like events. So next Tuesday evening, potentially that to keep an eye on, and then maybe another one Wednesday evening further to the north as this ridge kind of takes hold over this area of the country, kind of right on the periphery of that heat. If we have heat advisories and extreme heat warnings building in here, you can always kind of look to the northern edge of that for some of these kind of wind event or MCS events in July. So we'll be watching that closely because we're inevitably going to see heat advisories expand in this area next week. We'll take a look at those temperatures in a second. If we take the forecast out Thursday, Friday of next week, we still see precipitation chances through here. So despite that ridge building in, it's just flat enough. It's allowing some of this flow to get over the top of it and keep this corridor here in with additional precipitation chances. So it's not one of these dominant ridges that looks like this or that settles in over the northern Midwest that just blocks all precipitation. I mean, we're still getting flow out of this, thunderstorms, maybe even severe weather to talk about. We can see this just if we look at the WPC, the 7-day forecast with that flow over the top of the ridge. I mean, draw a line all the way, from Calgary, almost up near Edmonton, through what this would be like Dwight, Illinois. Let's get maybe Indianapolis and then over toward West Virginia. So just plenty of flow. But where we're not seeing that rain, right, is underneath that ridge as it moves up initially. We'll have to kind of, as in terms of the forecast, like exclude the remnants of this tropical system today over the southern Mississippi River Valley. And if you do that, you start to see an area opening up here with reduced precipitation over the next 7 days. We can see that if we just look at the 10-day European model forecast, right? So this area here, again, kind of excluding the tropical remnants today and tomorrow over that area. And you're seeing the areas underneath that ridge starting to get highlighted for drought risk. And that's important because of the heat that's going to be building in at the same time. We've seen areas go dry this year and the temperatures have not been too elevated, but we know for a fact that the evaporative demand is going to intensify quickly in this area at the middle part of July. If we get high temperatures here today, still on the cooler side for Friday, but we can start to see those warming up here, right? So Arkansas, we talked about those extreme heat warnings over toward the Carolinas, the eastern U.S. looking at some heat advisories here. So take this into Saturday and Sunday. You can see the heat starting to expand anywhere from the Black Hills all the way down through Florida. We take this into Monday and Tuesday. Now this heat expanding over a wider area here near that Nashville, maybe Cairo, Illinois, Ridge. Now the heat overspreading Kansas, Nebraska, getting toward triple digits, 90s for the rest of the Corn Belt, maybe mid to low 80s, I should say, in the maybe northern reaches of the Corn Belt. Just take this forecast from Tuesday into Wednesday, and then Thursday, you can see that heat really expanding. And the question then becomes, again, kind of where are we going to see this ridge maybe persist if it does at the end of July or August, or I should say the beginning of August. If we look at the 6 to 10 day precipitation outlook or temperature outlook from the Climate Prediction Center, again, right over Cairo, Nashville, maybe toward Springfield, Missouri. Precipitation over that 6 to 10 day period. This is kind of the end of the next work week. We see that increased precipitation chance across the northern Midwest and through Wisconsin, Michigan. Again, kind of keeping an eye on this area for continued dryness. But where we see that dryness settling in is over the south central portion of the country. So the southern plains over toward Arkansas and southern Missouri. And then if we look over toward the southwest with that, losing that high pressure, or I should say that ridge kind of nicely placed above the Four Corners area, we're starting to lose some of that monsoon flow as we get near the end of July. If we jump out to the 8 to 14 day outlook, see that heat expanding across more of the north central U.S., still some higher values here over the eastern U.S. So again, this kind of split in the forecast remains a question going forward. But cooler out west, cooler for New England as we near the end of July. Precipitation values there, again, starting to see this area link up with that 6 to 10 day dry concern with the 8 to 14 day dry concern. And so the areas for potential drought development are starting to get obvious in the long range here. We can kind of see this fork in the road from the ECMWF ensemble forecast. So this is the 500 millibar height. I'm going to drag this all the way out. I'm going to do this quickly. So this is next week, Wednesday. There's our Nashville high. Take it to Friday. All right, what city would we call it here? I'd still say maybe somewhere Nashville over toward Little Rock. This is the end of next week, the 25th. And then notice the ECMWF ensemble starts to pull that ridge pretty quickly back toward the west, almost to the point where we're going to call this now like a Denver high, certainly rather than a Nashville high. And the model runs late in the forecast time period after 10 days. We're all the way out kind of day 11, 12 here. They tend to park in summer a ridge here over the Four Corners because climatologically, that's kind of where we would expect one anyway. But this one is fairly amplified. And what I mean by that is it doesn't look like your typical ridge that would look like this. You can see it's starting to pull all the way up toward Montana and the Dakotas. The heat would be pulled up with that if this forecast were to verify. If I take the forecast even a little bit further out, you can still kind of see how amplified that ridge forecast is. So this is worth paying attention to as we near the end of July. This is July 31st now. For some of that drought risk pushing maybe further toward the west, leaving this area of the country cooler with more precipitation chances. Another way we can kind of look at that drought risk is if we just look at the Bermuda high. So kind of watching the North Pacific high here, if we keep this around and we keep the Bermuda high, average or stronger than average, the chance for precipitation in this part of the country stays elevated. That includes maybe portions of the plains as well. And sure enough, just here today, if we look at the forecast, that remains the case. We're seeing precipitation chances across the middle part of the country. And that persists, even next week too. But if we take this Monday, we see this low pressure system sneaking through the Bermuda high. That's happened plenty of times this year, as long as it's temporary, right? And we were able to rebuild in the Bermuda high, which it looks like it tries to do. Next week, we'll continue to see those precipitation chances, which is the case through the middle part of next week. We just talked about, potential derecho, maybe moving through that corridor there. So take the forecast out now, the 26th, 27th, 28th. You notice the ECMWF ensemble starting to show up with these weaker North Pacific high and weaker Bermuda high. And that's more of a kind of a bona fide drought risk for this portion of the country. So we're going to have to keep an eye on this, at least from this modeling. I'm taking this out to the 34st first. We don't see it kind of get back to normal, if you will, until the early part of August. As a result, if we just look at the rolling 5-day average or 5-day precipitation anomaly average, and I take that out through the 28th, now the 29th, 31st, you can see that area, just overlapping in the 5-day rolling window, starting to sneak some dryness maybe into the Midwest at the end of the forecast period. Another way we can look at this are what are the probabilities of receiving less than a half inch throughout the whole forecast time period. And it's going to take us out 10 plus days here. And you'll notice that as we get through next week, this is now Thursday of next week. This corridor here, right, it painted it from Alberta all the way toward Florida. Decent chance of significant precipitation. But if I take this 27th, 28th, 29th, 31st, still seeing greater than 50% chances for the southern plains, even extending toward Arkansas and Missouri, of less than a half inch of rain. And considering the heat that's likely to build in here over the meantime, and it's not going to take long for those drought classifications to start roaring back in this area, given some of the evaporative demand. I wanted to jump back and kind of look at this August question. So as we get into August, is the heat going to stay maybe more so over the west, or are we going to see more of a proper, Corn Belt heat episode settle in August that would produce potentially some drought concerns, given where we're at with the moisture situation? So I went back and looked at all the driest August. I started from 1980 and went forward, and I kind of did this to see if we could find some maybe analogs in the sea surface temperatures that we're dealing with right now. And if I looked at just August, the years that were lower, significantly lower in terms of precipitation were 2020, 13, 12. Some of these are going to look familiar: 08, 2003, 84, and 83. Some La Nina in here for sure. And when I looked at the 500 millibar height pattern, looking for the ridges, at least for this was for the Corn Belt specifically, so kind of this region here. And I'm pointing that out because more so, east of where some of that drought concern was, more so over the southern plains that we looked at over the 10-day forecast. And I found something unsurprising, that we had a big ridge over southern Canada and the northern Midwest. We just talked about how despite the heat building in next week, the ridges may be flatter, more so over, we called it Cairo, Nashville, Little Rock. And that's allowing flow to come through the Midwest. And that's the reason the 10-day precipitation forecast, if I can pull that up, looks like this, despite us talking about a ridge, parked here. If that ridge was more expansive like this area would be going drier. But in these forecasts, or in these analogs for August, or the historical examples, that ridge is more so parked over Canada, less so over this corridor here. We also see, general troughing over the western Atlantic and troughing here over the North Pacific. That's consistent with a weaker North Pacific high and a weaker Bermuda high in these years as well. And we see some of that right at the end of the forecast period. If we jump over and look at the jet stream anomalies from those same years in August, Eric kind of talked about this yesterday. In those years, not a lot of west-east flow. I mean, just about the opposite. Had a big trough here over Asia, a big trough here over the North Pacific. There's the big dominant ridge here over the northern Midwest, southern Canada. So not a lot of this. And we're actually seeing, a decent amount of that flow this year versus, what we saw in these drier years. Then finally, if we jump over and look at sea level pressure anomalies, a weaker Bermuda high, weak North Pacific high, that would be to be expected in those drier Augusts. And then sea surface temperatures, I found this to be kind of interesting. Some cooler waters here in the North Pacific, but you can kind of see that negative PMM signature, but that lack of, almost proper La Nina look to it. And that does look a little similar to this year. And then the cooler southern North Atlantic and the warmer northern North Atlantic. And that is a little bit similar to what we're seeing this year. So nothing to sneeze at here. But there are some differences, namely that a lot of the ridging we've seen this year has been flatter, setting up more toward the south, and we're seeing better flow this year than we saw in those years. And that held true even when I went back and looked at the July jet stream from those historical examples. So some similarities here, but some differences as well. It's not kind of screaming as a huge analog this year, but the sea surface temperatures are similar enough. And that kind of cooler PMM look, that less obvious La Nina look with some of the warmth here in the eastern Pacific. And this is even more obvious if I show you the current sea surface temperatures from the difference from the global means. Let's just comparing the sea surface temperatures across the globe to one another. You can see this kind of cooler look here, cooler southern North Atlantic, warmer northern North Atlantic. I mean, that starts to look a little bit similar to what we saw in some of these drier years here, so still something to keep an eye on. I did want to take this thought experiment out to the, I'm going to call this so what I plugged in here was the winter wheat belt, which looks like that. So more the southern plains up toward the continental divide in the northwest rather than the corn belt, which was something more like that. I plugged in the drier years for that. We have some overlapping years, but some other ones popped up like 88 and 2000. So 2020, 12, 2000, 88, 83, and 84. And what we saw this year was, less one of these big anomalous southern Canadian ridge and something a little bit more subtle with that North Pacific high. Moving just a little bit to the west. So we have a little bit more, flow here in these years. But despite that, these were the drier years for the southern plains. If we look at the vector wind over those same years, can see ridge here over Japan, East Asia, and ridge here, a little bit flatter of a ridge here over the northern Midwest, southern Canada, and some flow coming out of the Pacific here, enough to help induce this trough, and then ridge here in the eastern Pacific. And if we jump over and look at the sea surface temperatures, we actually see more of a La Nina connection given kind of the fewer years here and some of the stronger La Nina years in here. 2012 is included. We also see cooler waters here in the North Pacific in these drier years for the winter wheat belt. And we see that kind of similar cooler Atlantic, cooler central North Atlantic, and warmer northern North Atlantic. Again, this one doesn't scream as obvious maybe as a sea surface temperature analog with what we're dealing with now, but at least the flow being a little bit flatter maybe makes more sense with what we're seeing here in July. So again, not a perfect analog, not screaming, significant dry in July in terms of how similar, but there are enough similarities here to keep me a little bit concerned, maybe a little bit more for that corridor here over the western Great Plains, just given the kind of the flow that we have this year, maybe it lines up more with that. The Climate Prediction Center released their monthly temperature outlook yesterday, and this was highlighting that same area more so over the northwest versus kind of the central U.S. So less of that Nashville Ridge as we get into the next calendar month, and more so over the western U.S. The reason for this was strong agreement on some of the dynamical models that they look at, but also the sea surface temperature deficits, the soil moisture deficits in the northwest, given how dry it's been there. If we look at the precipitation outlook, wetter for the southeast, again, potentially looking at some tropical activity, and then with those soil moisture deficits more prominent in this corridor here, maybe seeing more of that ridge risk this far to the northwest. I was kind of surprised to see them, highlight that area so aggressively, and not maybe areas over the southern plains or the central U.S. But the Climate Prediction Center are calling for more of that northwest concern. And I will say one thing, kind of throwing a huge wrench into all of this, is if we see a lot of typhoon activity pick up in the West Pacific. In fact, I'm showing you the ECMWF ensemble forecast for all the different ensemble members and their various low pressure systems. And you can see just over the next kind of 24 hours expecting development here. And we actually kind of see this already here this morning north of the Philippines. And then if we take the forecast out into next week, potential additional development over that same corridor near Taiwan. And then as we get further out into the forecast period, I mean, a wide area of possibilities in terms of typhoons as we near the end of the month. If these recurve and head to the northeast near the Aleutians as a remnant system, they can do all sorts of wild things to the jet stream and totally break a persistent pattern that we're in. So if this area stays active, it's going to keep these forecasts changing and would maybe even reduce drought risk, just kind of given that these can induce some trough ridge. We call them Rossby waves, but just, transient flow, ridge one day, trough the next. It'd be one way to think about that. And then meanwhile, as I kind of wrap this up here today, if we just kind of reorient ourselves back to what we're looking at over the next 7 days, heat is going to be increasing as we get into next week across the Corn Belt. We're going to lose that kind of luck that we've had in terms of those high daytime temperatures, and the humidity is going to be coming up in a big way. On the periphery of that flatter ridge, right, Derecho concern as we get out to next week as well, certainly Tuesday and Wednesday. That continues. We'll have to watch that for some severe storms, but certainly a corridor of more significant precipitation over a wide area of the country over the next 7 days. And given that we're in the middle part of July and that rain can take the heat, or the worst of the heat, off the top of the day, I'm still looking at a relatively favorable forecast for production at this point, with some of that drought risk that we'll have to monitor here over the next 2 weeks in the southern plains, and a kind of question mark after that as to if that shifts more so over the northwest, or we see that Nashville high maybe strengthen here over the eastern U.S., continuing the heat and dry concerns as we get out into August. I'll leave it there today. Thanks for watching. Have a great weekend, and Eric will talk with you all on Monday.